has changed. Representatives Madaro of Boston and other members of the House move to amend the bill by adding after Section 15 double A.
There being no objection, the clerk will dispense with the reading of the remainder of the amendments. Does the chair hear objection? The chair hears none. The chair recognizes Mr. Madaro of East Boston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the members, I ask that when a vote is called, it be taken by a call of the yeas and nays.
Mr. Madaro moves when a vote be taken to be taken by a call of the yeas and nays. All those joining with him will please so inform their monitors. First Division, there being sufficient number having arisen or informed their monitors, when a vote is taken, it shall be taken by a call of the yeas and nays. The chair recognizes Mr. Madaro of East Boston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the amendment before us. I want to express my appreciation to Speaker DeLeo, Leader Mariano, and Chairman Michaelwitz for your wisdom and guidance from my early days in the building as a staffer to my time now as a representative. In particular, as a fellow son of East Boston, who grew up, like me, dealing with the consequences of unfettered airport growth, and thus has a deep and personal connection to this issue, I thank Speaker DeLeo for his unwavering commitment to improving our environment and air quality. I also want to thank the gentleman from Lowell and the gentleman from Lenox and his staff, particularly the late Bob Libben, for their work on this legislation. And lastly, I want to give special thanks to the gentle lady from Brockton and the gentle lady from Roxbury for their partnership, commitment, and hard work on behalf of this issue in the House. On my parents' mantle sits a photo of me when I was about 10 years old. I'm standing in front of the State House with my mom and dozens of East Boston residents, a sign in my hands protesting the expansion of runway 1432 at Logan International Airport. The East Boston community was staunchly opposed to the expansion of runway 1432 for the impacts it would have on our neighborhood. More pollution, more noise, more traffic on our streets. For decades, the airport had expanded for the good of the Commonwealth, but at the expense of our community and the people who live there. We lost that fight. The runway was expanded, but I will never forget that formative moment. The opposition movement to runway 1432 was my introduction to community activism and what led me on the path to where I am before you today. This afternoon, 21 years after my first experience in political activism, I stand before you on the floor of the House of Representatives to continue my advocacy on behalf of my community and many like it across Massachusetts, who bear a disproportionate impact of our Commonwealth's pollution. I stand today in support of environmental justice. Pollution and climate change affect us all, but it's important to recognize that these issues affect some communities more than others. Ask yourselves, when we're siting a power plant, or a major highway, or an airport, where do these projects almost always go? They don't end up in our affluent suburbs. More often than not, these kinds of polluting, environmentally harmful projects end up in the backyards of low-income, immigrant, and black and brown communities. They end up in communities like East Boston. East Boston, a historically immigrant community, now predominantly Latinx, and mostly working class, is home to Logan Airport, handling the vast majority of regional air traffic. We play host to the majority of the state's jet fuel and heating oil, brought up the Chelsea Creek, to big oil tanks along our waterfront. And cutting through the center of East Boston is Route 1A, the preferred daily route for thousands of North Shore commuters, and of course, the millions of annual car trips going to and from Logan Airport. These burdens harm our environment, releasing carbon and ultrafine particulate matter into the atmosphere and polluting our air. And it is my neighbors and I that breathe in these emissions and then suffer the consequences. Our planet is now facing a reckoning for decades of burning fossil fuels, but the burden of these fumes has been borne by EJ communities from the beginning. Those consequences are very real and directly impact the quality of life of my constituents. East Boston has some of the highest rates of childhood asthma, adult COPD, and other pulmonary disorders in the Commonwealth. More recently, we experienced the highest COVID infection rate in the city of Boston. This is no coincidence. It is a result of decades of environmental degradation and poor air quality. We have a duty to address the disparities and inequities which lead to communities like ours bearing the brunt of the Commonwealth's environmental burdens. This is environmental justice. Today, many of the activists who protested against Runway 1432 are gone, including my late aunt, Mary Ellen Welch, a legend of East Boston activism who taught me much about environmental justice and how to be an effective advocate. But a new generation of leaders has risen up to fill these big shoes. Grassroots activists and their allies from environmental justice communities across the Commonwealth, fighting to give their neighborhoods a voice. I want to thank the members of the Environmental Justice Table, a coalition of activists and advocates, for their leadership on this issue, inside and outside of the building. This amendment would not be before you today without their tireless dedication. In short, this environmental justice amendment will codify environmental justice into law for the first time in our state's history, and define environmental justice communities in a way that allows for real change in areas that need it most. It creates a higher threshold for review of new projects that could increase environmental burdens on a community, and mandates an improved, more robust community process to make sure that residents are aware of these projects and that their concerns are heard. The Massachusetts Constitution states that, quote, "The people shall have the right to clean air and water, freedom from excessive and unnecessary noise, and the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic qualities of their environment." Yet for too long, we have let low-income communities and communities of color bear a disproportionate burden of pollutants and environmental hazards, while excluding them from the decision-making process affecting their neighborhoods. The provisions of this amendment are the necessary first step in a long overdue process to ensure environmental equity and finally recognize environmental justice and EJ communities into state law. As we continue to work towards racial equality, we must also realize that environmental justice is racial justice. For many of our communities of color, equity is an issue ingrained into the very air we breathe. Adoption of this amendment brings us one step closer to fulfilling the promise embedded in our state constitution and furthers the House's commitment to addressing issues of racial justice and equity across Massachusetts. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment, and thank you.